So tonight we're going to look at these opposing theories, and let's see if my clicker works. It was working a moment ago, but that doesn't mean much. Hey, okay. So the point of part three, again, we can see this is part three of the minimal facts approach. And so this is to analyze opposing theories and compare their explanatory scope and power to the resurrection. I'm going to explain what explanatory scope and power means here in a minute. The big idea is that the resurrection of Jesus is the best explanation of the facts. So we're going to look at these theories. You'll see that all the theories listed here are opposing theories, except for, of course, the bodily resurrection of Jesus, which is what we're building this case for. But what about the other theories? How can they be divided? We can look at them as natural theories and supernatural theories. So there are some who believe that something supernatural happened, yet it wasn't the bodily resurrection of Jesus. We'll get to that. But first, there's the natural theories. And with the natural theories, there are internal theories and external theories. So what might be an internal theory? Something that would happen inwardly to make someone think Jesus rose from the dead.
Dream.
Yeah, dream or hallucination, right? That's what we've talked about a little bit. We'll talk about that some tonight. That's pretty much what the internal theory would be, is hallucination. But there are external theories, which are things outside of our mind, some things that may have happened to make the disciples think that Jesus rose and appeared to them. And so we need to look at those as well. And of course, we also need to explain the empty tomb. We need to explain the conversion of Paul and James. So look at the external. And then supernatural, again, there's subjective supernatural theories, which are kind of like a supernatural vision. We'll talk about that, and then lastly, the bodily resurrection of Jesus, which we're calling objective. So internal, external, kind of is parallel to subjective and objective, but it's just better for us to use different terms. Okay. All right, so let's begin with supernatural internal theories. Now, I'll explain, first of all, what explanatory scope and power is, because this is how we're going to be analyzing these. Right? We want to look at these theories that claim to explain these facts pertaining to the claim that Jesus rose from the dead. We want to look at these theories and say, okay, do these theories really explain the facts as well as Jesus' resurrection does? Explanatory scope is how many pieces of evidence does this explain, right? So you might have a theory that explains one thing, but it doesn't explain another, right? It might explain, at least to some degree, the appearances, but it doesn't explain the empty tomb. Or it might explain to some degree the empty tomb, but it doesn't explain the appearances. And by the way, tonight we are going to kind of simplify the four minimal facts just by talking about the appearances and the empty tomb. Because, of course, the conversion of Paul and James, those are also because of their belief that Jesus rose and appeared to them, just as the disciples, in fact, 2 of the minimal facts believe that Jesus rose and appeared to them. And then, of course, we can't ignore the fact that Jesus died, which will have some bearing on one of these. But let's first talk about hallucination. So what's the explanatory scope of hallucination, right? If someone says, okay, yes, I understand all of these facts that we've spent the past couple of weeks establishing. I understand that these facts are true, but here's how we can explain them, is hallucination. The disciples had hallucinations. So what's the explanatory scope? Well, a hallucination may account for the appearances. It fails to explain the empty tomb, right? So we talked about some good evidences for the empty tomb, and that is not accounted for in the theory of hallucination, right? Because if they were hallucinating, there would still be a corpse rotting in the tomb, and as I've said many times, they could have just rolled away the stone and said, look, here he is. So hallucination, at least it tries to explain the appearances, but it doesn't explain the empty tomb. So it doesn't have a full explanatory scope. Of course, the resurrection, on the other hand, it explains both, doesn't it? It explains all the minimal facts. It explains all the 12 known facts, those 12 facts that are on the the list on that sheet of paper that I gave you last week, and I do have some back there if you want to grab one. So the resurrection explains these, but hallucination does not. But what about explanatory power? So explanatory power is, okay, what about the data that it is seeking to explain? How well does it explain it? Okay? How well does it explain it? So hallucination, it doesn't even try to explain the empty tomb. But what it does try to explain is that the disciples sincerely believed that Jesus rose and appeared to them. But how well does it really explain that? Well, hallucination is an inadequate explanation for the appearances as they were experienced. Because, as we've noted, the disciples, they experienced these hallucinations in groups at many different times, in many different places. You don't have group hallucinations. You might have a hallucination all by yourself, but not in groups. And also corporeal manifestations. That's a fancy way of saying that it wasn't just like a vision, like they were seeing a ghost, a hallucination, but in fact they ate with Jesus, and Jesus prepared breakfast for them. Hallucinations don't do that, right? Now, of course, you could just say that the disciples are lying, but if we're going to accept that the disciples, from a historical standpoint, as a skeptic, the skeptic is going to say, well, yes, the disciples really believed that Jesus rose and appeared to them. You have to accept the reason why they believe that, and the reason why they believe it is because of the experiences they had with Jesus during that 40 days. They were convinced it wasn't a hallucination because they ate with him, and so on. Even many touched him. Okay, so hallucination doesn't explain the nature of their experiences, but of course the resurrection does. If Jesus really did rise from the dead, then it would make sense that they could touch him and eat with him and see him in groups, that kind of thing. Okay, so next. Oh, yeah, I've got the clicker now. You might remember Pinchas Lapide. I mentioned him in the last teaching. Pinchas Lapide is not a Christian. He is a Jewish scholar, and yet he accepts the resurrection. It's kind of a sad thing that has not converted him to Christianity, but he just believes that Jesus was a special prophet that God raised from the dead, but because of his preconceived notions of who the Messiah would be or what the Messiah would look like, he is not converted to Christianity. But he believes the resurrection just based purely on the evidence. And so that is helpful for building a case on the resurrection, because you could say, okay, this Jewish scholar, he doesn't believe in the resurrection because of some kind of spiritual conviction, but just because of the evidence. And here's one of his here's some of his reasoning for his belief in the resurrection. He says, if the defeated and depressed group of disciples overnight could change into a victorious movement of faith based only on autosuggestion or self-deception without a fundamental faith experience, then this would be a much greater miracle than the resurrection itself. So what he's saying is that, people who say that the disciples, that they had hallucinations, and that's why they believe Jesus rose from the dead, they're saying that this was as a response to their grief, maybe. At least that's one line of reasoning. Some say a response to grief. Others would say that they had this expectation, which really the New Testament is counter to that. The New Testament shows us that they did not have an expectation for him to rise from the dead. They didn't have an expectation for him to die. And when he did die, they were very defeated. And so oftentimes they'll take the line and say, well, it's like a grief hallucination. But when people have grief hallucinations do happen. But when people have them, they know that it's a hallucination, right? Even though they might say it seemed really real, they know it was a hallucination. And again, it doesn't happen in groups, and you don't eat with your hallucination and things like that. And so the point that he's making is, okay, if they were just convincing themselves, it was some kind of psychological thing, right? This would be an internal natural theory, right? It was just some kind of psychological thing where they were convincing themselves, and maybe they thought that they had seen them and they had a hallucination, and that caused them to change in the way that they did, to go from these defeated and depressed and scared disciples into these bold proclaimers of the risen Jesus, where they would die for the belief that Jesus rose from the dead. That could happen. That's a greater miracle than Jesus rising from the dead. That's what he's saying, because it just would not make sense for a hallucination to spur that kind of change. We see that they were thoroughly convinced to the point of even being willing to die for their belief that Jesus rose from the dead. Okay, so that's basically the the hallucination or self-deception. That basically entails all of the internal, natural internal theories. So now we'll look at natural external theories, and there are a few of them. So first is the swoon theory. This is an old theory, and this is the theory that many Muslims believe. It depends on how they interpret a passage in the Quran. There are actually some who have more recently taken a different position, and they've changed their interpretation. I think largely because the evidence of Jesus' death is so strong. But there are many Muslims, most Muslims would say that Jesus didn't really die on the cross. And some of them will say that someone took his place. It was like some kind of supernatural swap that took place. But then another theory has been that Jesus he didn't die, that he only swooned, that he appeared to die, but that he recovered later on. And so maybe the Muslims first came up with this, but many non-Muslims throughout history have taken this. It's not a very popular theory today, but historically it has been. And again, it's just the idea that Jesus didn't really die, right? He just came close to death, and they put him in the tomb, and then he kind of came to, and then that was the resurrection. Not really a resurrection, right? So while the swoon theory may account for both the appearances and the empty tomb, right? It doesn't account well for them, but it does account, right? If Jesus didn't really die, and they put him in the tomb, and then he woke up and he came out of the tomb, well, there's the empty tomb, and then he appears to the disciples, there's the appearances. So it would explain the empty tomb and the appearances, but what it does deny, it denies the minimal fact that Jesus died by crucifixion. And so here's where that minimal fact does come into play, right? The very first of our facts. And so it outright denies this fact that is unanimously agreed upon by all scholars who have studied the topic. So that's a problem. Of course, the resurrection doesn't deny Jesus' death because it says that he died and he rose. So what about explanatory power? Even though the swoon theory might explain the empty tomb, might explain the appearances, the swoon theory is a very poor explanation for the disciples' belief that Jesus rose and appeared to them, and it runs counter to Paul's teaching on the resurrection body. And the reason it's a poor explanation is because if Jesus was that close to death, and I mean all the things that we know biblically from his crucifixion, but even just historically from crucifixion, if someone survived it and then they came up out of the tomb, they're going to be in serious need of medical attention. There's not going to be any kind of thought that they rose from the dead. Especially when we look at the New Testament teaching, Paul's in particular, that Jesus had a glorified body. And actually we even see that in the Gospels, right? The way that Jesus is presented. It's not this half-dead guy who is in need of medical attention. It's someone in a glorified body. And it's because of Jesus' glorified body that we have the teaching that we will have a glorified body, right? That New Testament teaching is based off of Jesus' resurrection. And so if Jesus had just been close to death and then came to, it wouldn't make sense of this doctrine of glorified body. And again, it just doesn't explain the disciples' belief that Jesus rose and appeared to them, because that's a far cry from what they claim to experience. Of course, the resurrection, on the other hand, it explains everything perfectly fine, doesn't it? It explains why the disciples really believe that Jesus rose and appeared to them. It explains the empty tomb. It explains the conversions of Paul and James. And of course, it explains the fact that Jesus really did die, in the case of the swoon theory, which denies that. Okay. I'll take a time for questions once we get through these natural theories, so you can be thinking of them if you have any. Here's just a little tidbit on the medical side of crucifixion. 1986 study on the procedures and effects of scourging and crucifixion was published by the Journal of the American Medical Association. which concluded that interpolations based on the assumption that Jesus did not die on the cross appear to be at odds with modern medical knowledge. And so, of course, this is not a Christian publication. This was just a medical journal where they did a study of what's going on in the human body when someone undergoes crucifixion. And it says that any kind of interpretation or interpolation that would suggest that Jesus didn't really die is at odds with modern medical knowledge. Few reasons for that. First of all, there's going to be a ton of blood loss. And that's especially the case with Jesus, with the lashings that he received before his crucifixion. But also, one thing this study established was that asphyxiation, suffocating, that was the would be the most common cause of death for someone who's crucified. Because as you're hanging on a cross like this, your lungs don't have much room to expand, and so they would have to lift up on the cross in order to breathe. And after a long time, those suffering crucifixion would get very weary, and they would get shorter and shorter of breath and wouldn't be able to lift up. And there's one reason in particular why Jesus, towards the end, was not able to. Let me back up. I'm going down the wrong trail here. Typically, what would happen with someone being crucified is that their leg would be broken, right? And the reason for that was so that they couldn't come up to breathe, right? So that kind of confirms this medical study on asphyxiation being the cause. After some time of suffering, in order really to expedite their death, to keep them from rising up to get a breath, their legs would be broken so that they could no longer push up. Now, Jesus' legs were not broken, and the reason for that is because he was already dead. How did they know he was already dead? Well, probably just by the look of him, but probably because they could see that he wasn't lifting up like the others were, and they could see that he wasn't breathing, and so on. Now, they did do something to ensure that he was dead, and what was that? Yeah, they pierced his side. And that was not uncommon either. In fact, in AD 35, we read a Roman historian, Quintilian. He writes about this procedure of piercing a crucified victim's side in order to ensure their death. So both of those were common, but most often, and maybe they would do both sometimes, I'm not sure, but most often they would break the leg to keep them from lifting up. Jesus apparently was already dead. They didn't do that. And there's some prophetic significance to that, right? In the Psalms it says not one of his bones will be broken. And that's seen as a messianic psalm. And so I think that that's the reason why Jesus' leg was not broken. But when his side was pierced, we read that there was water and blood that came out, right? Now we know today, we have medical terms for it at least. Of course, they knew about the body then as well. But looking back on this procedure, and especially what John records about the blood and water coming out, it seems as though the heart and the pericardium was ruptured. So the pericardium, I understand, is kind of like a sac that's around the heart, right, Emily? Yeah, so it's kind of like a sac, and it's filled with water. And so if that is ruptured as well as the heart, then you're going to have blood and water come out. So Jesus was already dead because he wasn't lifting up like the others were. And to ensure that he was dead, his heart and his pericardium were ruptured. So that gives us even more certainty there from a medical standpoint. Okay, some more natural external theories. We'll hit these two at one time. Wrong tomb. Women came to the wrong tomb. Jesus was buried in one tomb, but they came to another, and they thought, oh my goodness, the tomb is empty. Jesus is risen from the dead. That's one theory. Another theory that you're more familiar with is that the disciples stole Jesus' body, which we read even in the Gospels themselves in Matthew. That was the first explanation for the empty tomb, that the disciples stole Jesus' body. While these may account, so for explanatory scope, while these may account for the empty tomb, they do not explain the appearances, right? Neither of them explain the appearances. Moreover, the latter that is, that the body was stolen by the disciples, that runs counter to the disciples' sincere belief in the resurrection, right? Because if they stole the body, then they would not have had a sincere belief that Jesus rose and appeared to them, and we have every reason to believe, and everybody agrees that the disciples sincerely believed that Jesus rose and appeared to them. So that really gives a hard blow to the stolen body. But again, even the wrong tomb theory, it does not explain the appearances. It only explains the empty tomb. And so the explanatory power of both of these is poor, because there's good evidence that Jesus was buried in a known tomb. And so this would, in particular, when we're looking at the wrong tomb theory, right? This was a known tomb that everybody knew about, so that would preclude the women from going to the wrong tomb. And even if somehow the women were mistaken, everybody else knew where the tomb was, and so they could have gone and corrected them. And then also the disciples, the second part would pertain more to the stolen body theory. The disciples had nothing to gain from stealing Jesus' body. Right? It would make no sense for them to steal his body and then to say, Jesus rose from the dead, kill me. Well, they didn't quite put it that way, but they were willing to die for Jesus' resurrection. And they didn't gain any kind of power or any prestige in claiming it. The stolen body theory has been largely abandoned, but its early emergence actually serves as evidence against another theory, that Jesus was never properly buried. So I said that we do have some good evidence that Jesus was buried in a known tomb. We'll get to that here in a moment. But even the existence of this theory that the disciples stole Jesus' body clues us in to the fact that, okay, there really was an empty tomb that had to be accounted for. People knew where the tomb was, and they knew that it was empty, and therefore they had to come up with some kind of theory. And the earliest one, which we see in the scriptures themselves, and we see it in other places as well, is that the disciples stole Jesus' body. To say that Jesus' body was stolen grants that Jesus was buried in a known tomb that was later found empty. So here's a quote from a Christian scholar, William Lane Craig. He says, "Even the most skeptical scholars acknowledge that Joseph of Arimathea was probably the genuine historical individual who buried Jesus, since it is unlikely that early Christian believers would invent an individual, give him a name in a nearby town of origin, and place that fictional character on the historical council of the Sanhedrin, whose members were well known." And then this is the last of the natural external theories, and that is legend. The idea that the belief in the resurrection was a result of legend. It developed over time. The disciples didn't originally believe it. The resurrection is legend. It necessarily denies all of the minimal facts except Jesus' death by crucifixion. All right, so we have these four minimal facts, 5 if you include the empty tomb. Right, Jesus died by crucifixion. The disciples believed that they had encounters with the risen Jesus. Paul's conversion because of the appearance of Jesus, and then James's conversion because of the appearance of Jesus. These 4 facts everybody attests to, and then also the empty tomb. All of those are denied by this theory except Jesus' crucifixion, which that's just kind of left untouched. A person that holds to this theory might even hold that Jesus wasn't even crucified. The point is, they're going against the stream, and they have a huge burden as far as what they have to prove. The resurrection, as legend, denies just about all the minimal facts, and so that's the explanatory scope, right? It doesn't account for all these facts. Doesn't account for any of them as they are presented in the minimal facts. And then as far as their explanatory power, well, it's poor because all of the evidence supports that early Christian belief in the resurrection did not result from legend. 1 Corinthians 15 is huge, right? Because we've noted that even unbelieving, skeptical scholars acknowledge the early date for that creed in 1 Corinthians 15, which claims that Jesus appeared to Cephas and to the 12 and to these others. And so they had this belief from the very beginning. Okay, so any questions on any of these natural theories? The internal theory, again, being hallucination, and then all these others being external supernatural theories. All right. So supernatural subjective theories. Visionary appearances. So I've noted that there are some who believe that something supernatural really did happen, but it wasn't the bodily resurrection of Jesus. It was some kind of supernatural vision. There are maybe a number of reasons a person would claim this, but it would seem that the main reason, if not the only reason, would be that hallucination doesn't quite do it, right? They recognize that hallucination would not be powerful enough for them to have such a sincere belief that Jesus rose and appeared to them. Hallucination wouldn't explain Jesus' appearance to groups, but what if there was some kind of supernatural, like, ghost appearance, like a visionary type appearance, which there's some flexibility here. Some would think of this as an objective. Well, this is under subjective. It gets complicated when we use these terms, but some would acknowledge these as something that could be seen by a number of people at one time. It's a supernatural appearance, but it's not bodily, right? So we're using objective for bodily and subjective for some kind of vision. But nevertheless, they say it's supernatural. And these may account for the appearances, but they fail to explain the empty tomb, right? So again, the explanatory scope is limited, and it only explains the appearances, but not the empty tomb. Of course, the resurrection, it explains both. What about the explanatory power? This theory is ad hoc, and what that means is that it's just kind of inventing something in order to appease some kind of preconceived notion. It's asserting that the reality is different than what it seems. It would say that there was some kind of supernatural visionary appearance. But there's no evidence for that. In fact, all the evidence points to that the disciples really did have encounters with the risen Jesus in bodily form. But they want to explain it another way with an absence of evidence, and so that weakens the explanatory power. Of course, the resurrection says, okay, no, it's just as it seemed. They really believed they had encounters with the risen Jesus, and that is in fact what happened. And so we finally get to the last one, supernatural objective theories, and it's really just one, and that is the bodily resurrection of Jesus. So the bodily resurrection, it has the best explanatory scope and power of all theories, meaning that it explains all the facts, it explains all the minimal facts, it explains the empty tomb. Again, if you look at the 12 known facts, it explains every one of them just perfectly. These facts that scholars from every stripe agree to, it explains them all. All of these other theories, they might explain one or another. Some of them might explain both the empty tomb and the appearances, but they're very weak for the various reasons that we looked at. But the resurrection, not only does it explain all of the facts, but it explains them quite powerfully, right? It explains them without any problem at all. But the problem is, and this is really what it comes down to. So if you've tuned out, tune back in, because we're almost done. Here's what it all comes down to. There are some people who just will not believe that a man who was dead rose again. All of this evidence is strong enough to convince somebody who's willing to entertain that perhaps someone could rise from the dead. But if someone is just going to say there's no way a person could ever rise from the dead, then of course this evidence isn't going to convince them. They're going to try to get out of it one way or another. So we can make them feel very uncomfortable by showing them all the evidence, and perhaps that could be used to bring them around, but there needs to be a fundamental worldview change, right? They need to at least be able to entertain the idea that possibly hypothetically that someone could rise from the dead. If they're not even willing to entertain that, then you can't get very far. I think N.T. Wright, who we'll look at next week, now this is a paraphrase, but he said something like, someone wants to base their whole worldview on the idea that it is impossible for someone to rise from the dead, then so be it. There's nothing that you can do about it. Well, maybe there's a little something you can do. You can challenge them to consider it because of all the evidence. But ultimately, here's what some of them are going to say. So Charles Hartshorne, he's a philosopher of religion. He's referring to these minimal facts of Habermas. In fact, I believe he's referring here to the 12 known facts. And so remember, that list of 12 facts I pointed to a couple of weeks ago. There's an atheist, Anthony Flew, who debated Gary Habermas. He conceded all of these 12 facts. So I believe here that Charles Hartshorne, because he is referring to that debate, and I believe he's referring to these 12 facts. And he says, I can neither explain away the evidences for the resurrection to which Habermas appeals, nor can I simply agree with the skeptical position. Right? So he's saying, I don't have an explanation. I can see that these facts are true. I can't explain them away, and I can't just simply say, okay, I'm skeptical. I can't just agree with the skeptical position because of how strong the evidence is. But he says, my metaphysical bias is against resurrections, meaning that he has this worldview commitment that a person cannot rise from the dead, and so therefore, no matter how strong the evidence is, I can't believe it. Or here's another. This is an atheist, a New Testament scholar, Gerd Ludemann. I referenced him last week, I believe. It says, if you say that Jesus rose from the dead biologically, you would have to presuppose that a decaying corpse, which is already cold and without blood in its brain, could be made alive again. I think that is nonsense. So that's very telling, right? It's very telling when you see these scholars who try to give all kinds of fancy explanations as to why Jesus didn't raise from the dead, and they give all of these different theories that we've looked at, and we can see that these theories are very weak, and some of them will recognize that if they're honest enough. Like the first quote, he recognizes that, okay, these other theories don't account for the facts. But nevertheless, if they have a worldview commitment that doesn't allow for a supernatural event like the resurrection, then you're just going to come to a stop there. Apologetics has a couple of purposes. One is that if the Holy Spirit is working in somebody's heart, God can use apologetics. He can use these kind of arguments to kind of knock down barriers and bring them around. So if a person who's a really skeptical person, they say, oh, the Bible is just a fairy tale, but yet God is working in their heart. God might use someone to say, you know what, there are actually some good historical reasons for believing in the resurrection. Here are a few. These are some things that even skeptical scholars agree with, and if you add all this up, it really appears that Jesus rose from the dead. If you show them that, and the Holy Spirit is working within them, then God can use that to bring them to the faith. Now, if their hearts are cold and there's no work of the Spirit, then they might be like one of these guys. But that's where we come to the second purpose of apologetics. So one purpose is, again, so that God might use these arguments to bring somebody to the faith. And also, it is an encouragement for believers. There's a purpose for believers as well. But when we're talking about unbelievers, one would be to bring them to the faith, but another would be to shut the mouth of the obstreperous. That's a quote from John Calvin. And he said that is the purpose of apologetics, meaning that there are people who are going to be speaking against the Christian faith. And they're going to advance all these kind of arguments and all these kind of slanderous things against the Christian faith. And one thing that apologetics can do is you come at them toe-to-toe and you say, okay, no, all the things that you are saying is unfounded because of this, and this. And it leaves them in a position like this saying, you know what, I can't explain that. I just don't believe in resurrections. And it kind of shuts their mouths, right, where they're not able to discredit Christianity in such a way that maybe it would weaken the faith of another person or maybe influence others in that direction. it comes toe to toe with him and says, okay, all truth is God's truth, and we're not going to let you spew these things and endanger people's souls. And so, let's talk about the facts, and let's lay your worldview bare. What we want to do is we want to show people that, okay, the reason that these people are coming against the resurrection is not because there are good reasons. It's because of a fundamental worldview position. So, all right. We'll close with this. There's actually a trend in scholarship towards the bodily resurrection of Jesus, and this is something fairly recent. If we go back a number of decades within New Testament scholarship, it was filled with skepticism, and we see this not only with the resurrection, but even with the reliability of the Gospels and things like that. There are a lot of really cool things going on in the scholarly world, recognizing that, for example, there's a guy who's done a work on the book of Acts, and he points out all of these historical markers, all of these things in the book of Acts that line up with other historical documents, and shows that the book of Acts is not unreliable, as many have said before. The book of Acts is actually a very reliable historical document. That's some recent work that's been done. And same with the Gospels and other New Testament books. And then with the resurrection, again, we see this trend towards bodily resurrection, when decades ago there were many more who were skeptical. So of all of those, remember, there were a lot of different natural external theories that we looked at. Right? The body being stolen, the wrong tomb, I can't even think of them all. There's another one is Jesus had a twin brother. I didn't mention that. That's not as common of a one. I think it's a really comical one. But we have all of these external natural theories, and then also the internal natural theory of hallucination. All of these just account for 1/4 of the scholarship. And that's pretty impressive. Of all of these scholars, skeptics and believers, atheists and Christians alike, 1/4 holds to any kind of natural theory. So that means that almost 3/4, there are a few who are agnostic on the matter, who say, I don't know. So that leaves us with just about 3/4 who hold that Jesus rose from the dead in some sense. So that would include the supernatural subjective theory of these appearances. And actually, so I referred to John Dominic Crossan a few times as one who does not believe in the resurrection. But here's a little secret. John Dominic Crossan actually claims to be a Christian. And he does claim that Jesus rose from the dead, just not bodily. Right? He claims that it was a spiritual resurrection. It was not a bodily resurrection, but just Jesus' spirit rose. I mean, he's actually very vague and confusing in his position. I've actually read a debate between him and N.T. Wright, and he's very, very confusing. But nonetheless, he calls himself a Christian, but he doesn't believe in the bodily resurrection. But of these who hold that Jesus rose from the dead in some sense, more than 3/4 holds to the bodily resurrection of Jesus. So if you're a mathematician, 3/4 of 3/4, whatever that is those in New Testament historical scholarship who hold to the bodily resurrection of Jesus. But again, 3/4 hold to some kind of supernatural resurrection. But we do need to stress that bodily resurrection is key, right? I don't think that we can say that someone is a Christian if they don't believe in a bodily resurrection of Jesus. I think that's pretty key. But you will have many who will call themselves Christians and believe in something else. Okay, so next week we will move on to N.T. Wright's approach, and we'll just spend 1 week on this. That's where he looks at certain mutations in belief of resurrection. A lot of this will have to do with the resurrection of the dead and what people believed about the resurrection of the dead, but also about the resurrection of Jesus. Beliefs that emerged in early Christianity that were very foreign to first century Judaism. And you have to say, okay, well, why did these beliefs about resurrection arise? What happened? And you have to give some kind of explanation. What N.T. Wright says is that the empty tomb and the appearances of Jesus, that is the only explanation, which of course those two things add up to Jesus' resurrection.